to that, we are joined here by David Kim himself, as well as Artosis, that'll be joining in this discussion with questions for David. But first of all, before we get to the nitty-gritty, David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really great. The games have been really good, and as Paulo said, the balance ratio of every race per every single round has been so perfect. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the balance itself is perfect, but I think it's cool that the WCS, all the top players here are very high skilled in every single matchup, and I think that's what's very cool about this event.
Yeah, and Dan, right before we start hitting David with all the hard questions, how are you doing today?
Really good. Like, we actually have an American in the top 4. That's amazing. We have 2 amazing Korean players left over, as well as a big underdog from Germany. It's like all these great storylines coming together. Can't wait to see those games, but kind of a little bit more excited to talk about the way the game is going to be going in the future here.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the major balance design patch that we're planning on for the end of the year. And the main goal for StarCraft II is to reach a place with the game where these big changes aren't coming into the game, but the game itself is still in a fun and very strategically diverse place just by rotating out the maps. And we're clearly not there yet, even though there has been a lot of great improvements to the game with Legacy of the Void. So we want to really take the time to clean up these little things and do a major pass.
Now, let's just jump right into it, because I'm sure everyone here is thirsty for the actual details that are coming into play here. So let's just start with Terran, because obviously a lot of big multiplayer updates coming. Yeah. Start with Terran.
So for Terran, obviously, mech play is the biggest thing for us. And in order to hit that goal, we think locating the problem first, I think, is the big step. And for that, our current thought is, because of the resource changes in Legacy of the Void, in some maps where the expansions are a little bit too far away, it's very difficult for mech players who have a very defensive army to really keep up with the expansion count. And in order to hit that part of the game, we wanted to redesign the Cyclone completely. And what the new Cyclone will do is the new Cyclone will lose the lock-on ability against ground targets, and instead it'll gain a solid anti-armored weapon. So what you can do with this new Cyclone is you can take this new Cyclone, combo it with another fast unit like the Hellion, and with this combo you can lock the enemies in their base, take expansions, or you can expand more aggressively and defend these different expansions by using the mobility correctly. So internally so far, we think this is working out great, and mech play definitely is not lacking in that area right now. And the second thing I want to talk about was removing the medevac pickup of the siege tanks in siege mode. And we've talked about this one before, and maybe around 50% of the people in the community kind of agree with us that this is probably, it wasn't the best move for Legacy of the Void. And the reason we say that is because the cool factor of the siege tank is siege tanks are very strong once they're set up, but they lack that mobility. And because of this medevac pickup ability, now we kind of have this mediocre unit where it's really strong when it's locked down, but you can also move it around so easily. So we wanted to kind of go back to the real fantasy of the siege tank of you can't pick these guys up with medevacs anymore, but the damage has been increased to like 70 right now against armored units, up from 50, which is current. So it's very strong, and even if this change turns out to be a little too overpowered, we don't want to really hit the damage part of it. Maybe we can increase the rate of fire, or the siege tank deployment time, things like that, to really keep this, once you set up, it's very strong, but you can't really move it that easily type of vibe.
Okay. I have a quick question about removing the pickup of the siege tank, because it seems like right now, a lot of the time when Terran is very close to dying to a lot of very early game attacks, it's the fact that you can pick up and move the siege tank that will keep them alive. Are you worried about that with this change?
Yeah, I think with that, we're most worried about the Ravager, but we made a change to the Ravager also for a different reason. Like, we think that because Ravagers were added in Legacy of the Void, the Roach Ravager tech route has been a little bit more of a preferred choice for Zerg, and we wanted to make that a little more diverse. So we wanted to hit different areas, such as Banelings or Hydralisks, things like that, but also we wanted to nerf the Ravager a little bit, and part of that is adding the armored flag. And because of this change, we feel that the relationship with the new siege tank is not as harsh as it could be, right?
That makes sense. are you looking to switch Terran into mech against everything, or more of a Brood War feel where it's like, oh, you could use Bio or mech against Zerg, but kind of mech against the other two races? Like, what's the aim of that?
Yeah, so we initially began our thought process thinking, what if mech was slightly the more preferred option against one of the races, and bio was the slightly preferred option against one of the other races? But as you know, when we make these changes, they don't always turn out exactly as we planned. So we're going to have to see how these changes plan out. And yeah, we'll make the final call after we have done the public testing.
Now, I'm sure a lot of Terran players had their ears peeled for that, but of course we do have, I'm sure, a lot of Protoss fans in the audience as well. So why don't you let us know what the Protoss updates are?
Yeah, so before we get into Protoss, I'd like to just mention that there are a lot more changes besides just these two that I talked about for Terran. And for the other races, it's very difficult for us to get into every single change that we're planning on with the reasoning. So we are having a blog update right after this interview. So you can check that out to check the exact list of changes that we're thinking about, as well as the reasoning behind. So going into Protoss, though, I think the main thing, if we're going to make mech viable for Protoss, is to correct the late game scenario against Protoss. And what I mean by that is because Tempests are 15 range against ground, and also they're so good for supply cost. They only cost 4 supply right now. So because of this reason, all Protoss players really need to do is mass more Tempests in the late game, and they just keep poking at the Terran army, and the only choice Terran has is, okay, I have to attack, because if I don't, I'm going to slowly lose everything, right? So we wanted to make that relationship a lot cooler, and how we want to get there is we want to make a change so that against ground units only, they don't have this 15 range, they have a more normal range, but instead they have a new ability called Disruption Sphere, which we used to internally call it as the Death Ball ability for fun.
The Protoss Death Ball.
Yeah. But what this ability does is if you shoot this Disruption Sphere at the target ground, it stays there for 45 seconds, which is a very long time, dealing small amount of damage over a long period of time. So the relationship that we're kind of hoping for is Protoss players can choose at which choke points or at which siege tank lines you're going to shoot this Disruption Sphere on. And Terran players, on the other hand, have that option to, okay, am I going to move these siege tanks out because they're going to slowly die over time? Or am I going to still take the damage because I know that Protoss players will come into my siege tank line once I unsiege? So there's a lot of choice depending on that battle on both sides, and we think it'll be a lot more interesting. And the next thing I wanted to talk about for Protoss is Dark Templars. Obviously...
Your favorite unit, right? Artis?
Oh, of course.
Obviously, we don't want to buff Dark Templars right when they come out because they're in a strong state right now. But what we want to hit is, as we saw from many games where Dark Templars were used yesterday, they're very strong right when they come out, but once the detection is set up, they just turn into Archons because there's not much you can do, right? So we said, what if they get an upgrade that takes a long time to research, and then after that point where the other side has a lot of detection available, they can become a little more useful, and it can be a lot more fun to play with and to watch. So we've tried adding the Blink ability as an upgrade on the Dark Shrine. And some people are saying no, but I'd like to point out that this change, I think, is one of the more riskier changes to the game compared to other things that we're going to talk about. And obviously, we're not going to finalize any decisions here. And we want to really publicly test all these changes out before making the final decision. So I don't think anyone really has to be too worried about the game being broken, things like that, because we definitely have the time and months to really figure out what the right step is for all of these changes.
Yeah, and Artos, I see you nodding and processing all this information. What questions do you have for David?
Well, I do actually kind of like the idea of Blink on the DTs to make them really good in the late game, like a very viable choice. But you mentioned changing the Tempest. That sounds cool. I just wonder about some of the units that we don't really see used very much from Protosses, like Carriers and Void Rays. Do you have any plans to maybe switch those up, get those used a little bit more?
Yeah, for the Carrier, we want to make a change so that right now we think the ability add of releasing interceptors was not that cool of an add, because all it is a one-click test to get a DPS boost out of the unit. So what we're playing around right now is we tried removing this ability, but instead making the interceptors cost only 5 minerals instead of 25. So the idea here is the unique part about the Carrier is that you can damage it slowly by killing the interceptors, but you really have to go for the Carrier itself to destroy it. And right now, because the interceptors cost so much, you can actually just bleed out the enemy's minerals. So we think with this type of change, yeah, you can buy some time with killing the interceptors, but having to really go after the carrier, and with the carrier micro changes that we did in Legacy of the Void, we feel like we can see some of that a little more, and because the cost of the unit has been reduced quite heavily, we think they're going to be used more as well.
Okay, that's pretty cool. One thing that I'm sure that I would get crucified for if I did not ask, any idea, like any changes to the Adept?
So currently, we're not specifically looking for a change with the Adept, though that is possible, but we are looking to buff other options as counter options to the Adept as well, right? So for example, the Siege Tank damage buff will be pretty huge against not just Adepts, but all of Protoss ground units. And on the Zerg side specifically, we see that strategy where Zerg players like Dark especially go for the Zergling plus Baneling strategy, and we want to do a little bit of a health buff to the Baneling so that they can get in a little easier. So it doesn't really change that relationship of doing that split micro, is that especially Terran players have been mastering over the years, but at the same time you can kind of guarantee a little bit more of that damage.
Oh, that's really cool, actually. But I'm just trying to imagine casting a game where a Baneling gets transfused. That would
It'll definitely be very, very different. But of course, we do have one more race to talk about, and that is Zerg. And I'm sure after hearing these already exciting changes, the Zerg players are avidly waiting. So why don't you tell us?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to talk about with the Zerg is what I mentioned a little bit earlier of the tech choice becoming a little too focused on the Roach Ravager side. And in order to do that, we talked about the Ravager changes as well as the Baneling changes. So we're thinking maybe Roach Ravagers will still be viable, but Zergling, Baneling will be a little bit more strengthened as well. But on top of that, I think the more interesting change is testing to see if Hydralisks can serve as a core unit. And in order to get there, we've made two changes. First is a range upgrade to the Hydralisks, so they will come out with 6 range instead of 5, and after the upgrade, they'll become 7 range instead of 6.
Wow.
And the second thing is, after they research the speed upgrade, we want to make sure that they get the speed boost on creep, like any other Zerg units do, which Hydralisks specifically don't right now. Right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine how strong this is, especially against Protoss, when Zerg players are spreading creep very well. The movement speed buff of such high movement speed, and then internal play testing wise, we're seeing that Hydralisks can definitely be core to that matchup specifically, and it's very fun to use this new type of really agile, fast moving, if you have been keeping up with the creep spread well type of unit.
Wow.
I'm just trying to imagine this right now.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I want to talk about for the Zerg is the Infestor. In order to strengthen the Infestor and have it a little bit be more of an interesting and unique type of a caster, we are thinking on 2 changes. And again, I think this one is a little bit more out there as well. So we'll definitely have to test before we can finalize these changes. First is casting all the abilities while burrowed. And second is a new ability add called Deep Tunnel. So for 50 energy, you can actually deep tunnel to anywhere on the map where you have vision.
That's pretty crazy. I really like that change to the Infestor. I think we'll definitely see it more from that. Is there any idea of like what to do with the Swarm Host? That feels like the unit that we see the least alongside the carrier.
Yeah, for sure. So for the Swarm Host, we want to make sure that this current role is actually good for the unit. And as you know, because they're not used that much, we haven't had a chance to really double check if the unit's role is good or not. And with this pass, because we are going to be publicly testing these changes in the test map, we have that option to just really buff it. So right now, the cost has been reduced to something like 100 minerals and 75 gas. So the idea here is to really force players to use it to make sure that the role is good. And if it is, we'll maybe bump up the number a little bit to something that makes sense, and we'll leave it the way it is. And if the role turns out to be not so great, then we can think about a redesign to that unit as well.
Really, really cool. Is there going to be any change in like the Zerg air army? Is that going to be how you want them to deal with the increased power of Terran mech? Because it seems like with the new siege tanks that it doesn't matter how long range your Hydras are, they're going to crush just about everything on the ground.
Yeah, we think the tools are there right now, especially with the Viper and the Broodlord, units like that. But we'll have to see because that's such a big change, especially the one that you just mentioned. So we'll test to make sure that that's okay. And if that's not in a good place, we can always change it going forward as well.
I kind of have a question about the overarching strategy of this balance patch. Last year, obviously after BlizzCon, we had Legacy of the Void came out, changed the game completely. This one has so many different changes. I know there's a bunch that you're not even getting into right now because we don't have that much time, but it seems like it's such a big change as well. Is this going to be like an ongoing thing over the years? Like, are we going to get like a big balance patch, or are you looking to find like a perfect place?
So I think we are definitely looking to get to that perfect place, but it's difficult to say how many of these major patches it'll take, right? Because we thought at the release of Legacy of the Void that we would be there, but obviously as this year progressed, we realized there are some holes that are remaining. So we'll take as many passes as we need to get to that final goal, but for now we're thinking it's best to really focus on this and make sure that this is the final step. And if it's not, we can always go back and do another major patch if needed, right? But for now we're thinking to really go all out and address all the issues that are currently within the game right now.
Now, obviously, you just mentioned a lot of different changes that are going to be made, but what is the path to getting all of this live?
Yeah, so we're planning on putting up the balance test map next Tuesday, or this coming Tuesday, and we definitely want to have more participation for this balance test map for obvious reasons. So we want to add a matchmaking queue to it, but it's actually taking a little longer than we had hoped, so maybe it'll come out a few weeks after that. And we want to aim for the release time frame of right after BlizzCon, so that we have time to polish these changes till after BlizzCon, until the start of next year's season, and so that we can be in a great place at that point.
Now, I know you mentioned that obviously this is a lot of information and there's so much that you haven't been able to address since we are under a time constraint, but if people do want to access all this information, where's the best place for them to go and look at that?
Yeah, so we'll have the blog post coming up right now, so you guys can check it out at StarCraft2.com and definitely give us feedback. And after you have play tested, once the test map goes live, we'll definitely work together with you guys to make sure that all these changes are good.
All right, well, thank you very much, David. Dan, do you have any last questions for him?
Just a comment. I think that you guys are doing a great job. The game is better than it's ever been, and I'm excited to see Mech finally really come back.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, thank you so much, David. I'm looking forward to seeing the community's feedback on this.